A happening which symbolized the early 20th century is the First World War, referred to during that time as the Great War. The idea of war was especially welcomed in Britain, since they saw it as an opportunity to set matters straight with Germany. In 1914, the Great War began, and the optimism of the patriotic citizens of Britain resulted in approximately 500,000 young soldiers being sent off to war in the first week. The country assumed that the war would be over after a shorter period of time. However, the war lasted 4 years, in other words, in 1918. Apart from the fact that the glory of Britain almost completely vanished, nearly a whole generation lost their lives.
In the beginning of the century, women continued to be the possession of their men. Therefore, Emmeline Pankhurst founded the Social and Political Union for Women in order to break the culture and fought for women's equal rights in the society. The Women's Social and Political Union made speeches and rioted to increase the effect.
So what were the consequences of which Sandra mentioned? The society was shocked by the ferocious movement. However, no actual arrangements were made. The women who dreamed of legal equality had to wait until the Great War broke out in 1914. While the men were at war, the women had to take their place in the labor market. This happening concerned all the classes in the society. Everyone had to work. With the women having a more significant role in society, in 1918, the right to vote was given to women above 30 years old. It was a step in the right direction. However, it would take an additional 10 years before complete equal voting rights were a fact.
When the American Stock Exchange collapsed in 1929, it did not only impact America, but Europe and Britain as well. The unemployment that followed rose to a shocking 3 million. This was called a depression, and it continued until the beginning of the Second World War.
John Steinbeck was a writer who was born in 1902. Most of his work captured the realities and lives of working-class Americans, and since he was born in California, much of his work takes place in Salinas, close to San Francisco. The most popular of his work is called Grapes of Wrath. It is about the Yode family from Oklahoma, which struggles to make a living. The family loses their farm and travels to California to try for a better future. But even though they find work as fruit pickers, they still struggle to make it through the day. The novel is based on a real story and shows us the breakdown of the American dream. Grapes of Wrath praised Steinbeck with not only fame, but also with a Nobel Prize in 1962. Many of his earlier works are very popular as well. For example, Of Mice and Men, Pearl, and Tortilla Flat. His novel, East of Eden, is one of many novels that was adapted into films, and it features the popular actor James Dean.
Ernest Hemingway was an important literary icon who was born in Illinois in 1899 and grew up in Chicago. He volunteered as an ambulance driver during the Great War and later wrote A Farewell to Arms based on his experiences. After the war, he moved to Paris, joining the many other writers of the Lost Generation, where he wrote the international success, Fiesta, or The Sun Also Rises. He later wrote The Old Man and the Sea, which won the Pulitzer Prize and Nobel Prize for Literature. A sufferer of depression, he committed suicide 9 years later in 1961. He became an icon because of his famous literary technique, the iceberg, or hard-boiled technique, in which writers use direct languages with emotions hidden in the subtext.
David Herbert Lawrence was born in 1885, and he was apparently the first British writer who was born in a working-class family. After Lawrence was educated at the University College of Nottingham, he followed in his mother's footsteps and began working as a teacher. One special thing about Lawrence is that in his novels, his characters were using quite simple and uneducated language, which was very new at the time. Lawrence was a man filled with love for women, and for that reason he just couldn't stop himself from falling in love with the wife of his tutor at the university. Her name was Frieda von Richthofen, and she was a German woman, which just made him even more of an outcast than he already was. The fact that Lawrence and Frieda fled the country and got married in 1914 alienated him. That did not stop him from writing, though. He was an extremely productive writer and didn't only write novels, but also poetry, plays, and critical essays. The Rainbow, 1915, and Woman in Love, 1921, are regarded as his two masterpieces. They are both novels about human consciousness, explored through the relationship between men and women in all aspects. Lawrence was very frank when it came to sexuality. He was not afraid of using vulgar words like fuck in his writing, which gave him a reputation of being an indecent writer for a very long time. His attitude towards women was, however, very positive, which can be seen in the article. D.H. Lawrence's manuscript shows enlightened attitude to women by Alison Flood at The Guardian, published 11th of April 2013. In the article, Alison Flood explains how D.H. Lawrence in his manuscript, Lady Chatterley's Lover, has a really humble attitude towards women, which gives an insight on his view on women.
The term Lost Generation was founded by the American writer Gertrude Strain, whom, like many others from the same period, chose to leave her homeland and move to Paris, the city that attracted expatriates from many different countries, in particular writers from Britain as well as the USA sought out the cafes in Paris, that soon evolved into literary workshops. Stein owned such a literary salon. It welcomed all the new arrived writers like Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald. When Stein expressed the term the Lost Generation, he meant that they belonged to the post-war generation that was indifferent, having no interest in taking responsibility. The British writer Virginia Woolf, who was known for her experimental and innovating writing, has become a symbol of modernist fiction and the women's movement. Due to her status of coming from an intellectual and upper-class family, it provided her with an education as well as certain traditional demands in relation to marriage and motherhood. Woolf saw these demands as obstacles obscuring her way to reaching her full potential and becoming a successful writer. Despite her ambition, she got married, but they never conceived children. Woolf's whole life was consumed by writing, but she also suffered periodically from depression. She eventually committed suicide in 1941 by drowning herself in the River Ouse, close to her home. Within her life, she produced many well-known works, both fictional as well as critical.
Wilfred Owen was one of few anti-war poets during the Great War. He's known for voicing the true reality of the war, and in his poems he wrote of the noises, terror, and death which the soldiers experienced. Owen himself became an officer and then used his own first-hand experience to speak his mind against the war through his poetry. One of his most famous poems, Anthem for Doomed Youth, is a piece where he compares soldiers to common cattle due to that they are equally expendable. It reads, "What passing bells for those who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns, only the stuttering rifle's rapid rattle can patter out their hasty orisons." In 1918, Wilfred Owens was killed in France 1 week before Armistice Day.